Hello students, we are going to start with T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, and in today's lesson we are going to deal with the epigraph of the poem and the two books of anthropology that are referred to in Eliot's notes on the Waste Land. And the two books are Miss Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance and Sir James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, a study in magic and religion. So the Waste Land focuses our attention on the different facets of life without belief, on the terror and agony that accompanies a loss of belief, as said by Frederick Hoffman, and severance of man from the divine, which implies man's absolute dependence on himself. There is no moral authority beyond him to curb his wayward instinctive urges. No objective value exists in the wasteland of his anarchic, self-seeking pursuits. Life is monetized. Man-woman relationships are based on vulgar sexuality. Every human being moves like an automaton with a parched spirit and deadened soul. His is a world where the will to believe is frustrated by the fear of life, says George Williamson. However, the poem not merely is a cry in the wilderness over something past and gone. It is a positive assertion of the need to rehabilitate a system of belief known but now misdirected. This is what Cleanth Brooks has to say about the poem Wasteland. The history of ancient myths and legends and of early Christian rituals shows that people once had strong belief in the meaning of life and death, and that every pursuit was guided by belief. We may be proud of our scientific knowledge and rational method of inquiry, but we do not have any generally accepted myth or any common background of belief to hold us together. This is what David Deutsch says. Every action of ours is misdirected. Our pursuits are aimless. Our will to believe is paralyzed. So the epigraph of the poem The Wasteland comes from the Satyricon, a satire by Petronius Arbiter, a Roman satirist. In this satire, there is a narration of the story of the Sibyl of Cumae. In Greek mythology, Sibyls were women of prophetic power, and that of Cumae being the most famous of them. She was the beloved of Apollo, who granted her the gift of immortality but without eternal youth. The result was she grew old and withered with the passage of time and longed for death, but death would not come to her because she had been rendered immortal by the Lord Apollo. And these lines that appear in Roman, they have been uttered by the drunken Trimalchio, who is in a boastful state, in a drunken state, and he is trying to score a point over his drunken companions in telling stories of wonder. The Sibyl of Cumae is said to have guided Aeneas through Hades, and his journey is described by Virgil in Aeneid. However, the Satyricon or Virgilian prophetic woman seems to have degenerated into Madame Sosostris in the Wasteland. So we'll come across Madame Sosostris and her tarot pack of cards in the first section of the Wasteland. So these lines, their English translation stands like this. Once I saw with my own eyes the Sibyl at Cumae near Naples, hanging in a cage, and when the children said to her, "Sibyl, what do you wish?" She answered, I wish to die. The epigraph suggests the theme of the poem, that is, the life in the modern wasteland is like a living death or a life in death, just like the life of the Sibyl. So, but as the poem was influenced by Freudian psychology, the term death wish is justified. But this needs to be modified also, because the desire to die is also followed by a wish to live spiritually. Man may be motivated to die physically with the ultimate objective of living spiritually ever after. Thus, we may see that the negative note that seems to strike in the epigraph of the poem may be also termed as a prelude to an optimistic future. Then the second line, that is in Italian and is referred to or said for Ezra Pound, comes from Dante's Purgatorio as a tribute by Guinicelli to Arnaut Daniel, who is the 12th century Provençal poet and artist. And the meaning is, or the translation is, the better craftsman. So Eliot calls Ezra Pound a better craftsman. Eliot's unreserved recognition of Pound's talents, which transformed the sprawling, chaotic poem that The Wasteland originally was, which was also termed as a jumble of good and bad passages, that was transformed into an enduring work of art by Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound himself wrote a witty poem on his role, and that role was that of a midwife in the birth of the wasteland. And he says Ezra performed the Caesarean operation. In this poem there is a line like this. And ultimately the poem, the final form that comes out is of 434 lines, and Ezra Pound described this poem as the longest poem in the English language because of its profundity, perplexity and density of poetic allusions, myths and meaning. So these are the notes on the poem The Wasteland given by Eliot himself, where he says, or where he refers to two books he is indebted to: Miss Jessie Weston's From Ritual to Romance and Sir James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion. These two books on anthropology deal with the patterns of beliefs held by the ancient people, explaining the spiritual meaning of life. Though the material life is never denied, still there is more emphasis on the spiritual meaning of life. The ancients, they sought the meaning of life in this world, and they make their lives purposeful and happy. So the poet, he uses the legendary story of the Grail as given by the Miss Jessie Weston, and the story goes that there was once a fisher king who grew sick and impotent as a result of the sins of adultery and fornication committed by him, and the whole country was inflicted with drought. The land became sterile and the women barren, and it was believed that this curse could only be lifted if some sexually pure stranger went in search of the Holy Grail and put right questions and gave right answers. Only then the curse could be removed from the king and his country. So many of the knights of the King Arthur's Round Table, they went in search of the Grail, but they were overpowered, or they failed to accomplish. So ultimately, Sir Parsifal succeeded in his quest, reaching the Chapel Perilous. After many hazards, Sir Parsifal solved the riddles of the Grail and the lance, and the Fisher King regained his potency and his country its fertility. So the belief of the Fisher King, who lived through a state of agony, of a life of despair, but waited hopefully for his Redeemer to come and save him. This belief ultimately came to be true. So the spirit of this legend was assimilated into the story of Christ's crucifixion. In the Arthurian stories, it is said that the Grail was the goblet that was used by Christ to celebrate the last communion. Later, when Christ bled at the crucifixion, at his time of crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea, he caught the blood in this goblet. The goblet was later lost and was searched by many knights. Later on, the search became a symbolic quest for spiritual truth. The quester had to go to the Chapel Perilous and put certain questions about the Grail and the lance which had pierced Christ's side when he was crucified. The recovery of the land's fertility depended on the successful emergence of the quester from the ordeal. But what about us Fisher Kings? The question is raised in the wasteland and our wide wasteland. What are we, or how are we going to sort out our problem, or how are we going to lift this waste? We have violated the normal or the moral norms of essential human values. In the absence of a coherent system of belief, we have become culturally impotent, the modern wastelanders that we are, and we have been rendered valueless. And in our socio-economic and political structures, our spiritual soil has been rendered totally sterile. The lady of our pious feelings and emotions has been rendered barren. So, however, in certain moments of introspection, we are visited by a question echoed by our own conscience. And the question is, shall I at least set my lands in order? So, it is a question as well as an imperative demand on us to set our land in order, which is the wasteland. Then the second book, in which Sir James Frazer, he has provided Eliot with another dimension of the belief of the ancient people. The primitive fertility myths and their adaptation in Christianity as the myth of crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, ensuring the spiritual fertility of the soul. Man has created gods in his own likeness, writes Frazer, and being himself mortal, he has naturally supposed his creatures to be in the same sad predicament. The savage people were greatly worried over physical decay following old age, and they feared death. So they could do nothing to avert the inevitable impairment of their bodies and death, but as a strategy of self-defense, they believed that their man-god must be killed as soon as he showed signs of his power's failure, and his soul must be transferred to a powerful successor. So, these primitive people living in the lap of nature were its great worshippers, and so they had their nature gods as well. The cyclic change of season also taught them lessons of birth, life, decay, death, and regeneration. So they interpreted the decay of plants in winter as an enfeeblement of the spirit of vegetation. The spirit has grown old and weak and must therefore be renovated by being slain and brought to life in a younger and fresher form. Thus, they believed that by killing the representatives of the tree spirit in spring, they sought to quicken the growth of vegetation, because they believed that the spirit would be resurrected in a more youthful and vigorous form. So, tortured by the cruelty of winter, the primitive people drove the gloomy season away through magical rites, and they made smooth the path for the footsteps of returning spring in this manner. So the purpose behind the performance of magical rites was the regulation of seasons to suit their daily physical needs. The people of Western Asia and Egypt, they buried their gods under the names of Osiris, Tammuz, Adonis and Etis every year, who rose again from the dead. This ritual represented the yearly decay and revival of life, especially of vegetable life. Fraser's view of the implications of the fertility ritual prevalent among the Syrian peasants applies to all such rites. So their views of the death and resurrection of nature would be colored by their views of the death and resurrection of man, by the personal sorrows and hopes and fears. So from these primitive myths it is gathered that the pagans led a community life and had a commonly accepted pattern of belief and relied on a power outside them which brought them together in a cohort. Though the pain and suffering of existence is always an individual experience, they looked at the existential problems from the community point of view, which provided them fortitude, courage, and strengthened their convictions and beliefs. The Christian myths of crucifixion, burial, and resurrection also signify the noble ideals of the service of humanity and sacrifice of an individual for the sake of society, and the regeneration of values embodied in the selfless, pious soul which sacrifices itself to perpetrate or to perpetuate them. After their short eclipse by the antagonistic forces of these values. So Eliot derived from these rituals a spiritual vision to look at life's vulgarity and emptiness that is hallowed by the smoldering fire of the quest of belief in life's meaninglessness. Lillian Feder calls it a religious vision. She says, for Eliot, ritual provides an aesthetic means of expressing a religious vision. In his poetry adaptations of both pagan and Christian rites enact the persona's quest for meaning and permanence in the universe. So that's all for today. Thank you so much.